In 1923, a young man named Walt Disney sat in a Kansas City bankruptcy court and watched everything he had built dissolve into nothing. His animation studio, Laugh-O-Gram, the company he had poured every dollar and every hour he had into, was gone. He had already been fired before that, from a newspaper job, by an editor who looked at his work and told him, directly and without apology, that he lacked imagination and had no good ideas. 2 failures before he was 22 years old. And then he got up, moved to Hollywood with $40 in his pocket, and started again. Not because the evidence told him to, not because anyone around him suggested it was a reasonable thing to do, but because of something inside Walt Disney that the bankruptcies, the firings, and the verdicts of every person who had already written him off had never been able to find and destroy. And what that thing was, what it is called, how it works, and how it is different from everything most people have been told about persistence and resilience, is exactly what the next 8 minutes are going to show you. Because Walt Disney is not the only man whose story reads like this. In the early 1980s, a man named Howard Schultz walked into his 217th investor meeting with a vision for a company that would change the way America experienced coffee. 217 times he had made his case. 217 times he had been told no. And Sam Walton, the man who would go on to build the largest retail company in the history of the world, lost his first store at 44 years old, not to a bad decision or a market collapse, but to a landlord who took the thriving business he had built and handed it to his own son. 3 men, 3 complete collapses, and the same decision made by each of them at the moment when stopping was not just reasonable, it was the only thing the evidence supported. The difference between the men who built empires and the men who almost did comes down to one thing. And by the time this video is over, you are going to know exactly what it is. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if videos like this give you something real, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss what we uncover next on The Silent Fortunes. Walt Disney, Howard Schultz, and Sam Walton did not succeed because they were more talented than the men who almost built what they built. They did not succeed because the timing was better, or because they had connections that other people lacked, or because fortune happened to favor them at the right moment. The difference between these 3 men and the men who came within inches of building something extraordinary and stopped comes down to one specific decision, made at the exact moment when stopping was not just understandable, but completely justified. And that decision was not about effort. It was not about working harder or longer than everyone else. It was about what they chose to believe the failure meant. Conventional wisdom says that persistent failure is a signal. That evidence accumulates. That a rational man eventually reads the room, adjusts his expectations, and accepts what the results are telling him. And for most people, reasonable, intelligent, hardworking people, that is exactly what happens. The first failure is a setback. The second is a pattern. The third starts to feel like a verdict. And somewhere between the third and the fourth, most people make a quiet internal decision that they will never fully admit to themselves, that the evidence has become undeniable, that the room has been read, and that what they were trying to build was never going to work. Carol Dweck, a psychologist at Stanford University, spent decades researching exactly why some people interpret failure this way and others do not. What she found, documented across hundreds of studies and published in research that has since become some of the most widely cited work in psychology, was that the people who ultimately succeed are almost never the ones who fail less. They are the ones who interpret failure differently. They see it not as evidence of a fixed limitation, but as information about what needs to change. Walt Disney did not read his bankruptcy as proof that he could not build something. Howard Schultz did not read 217 rejections as proof that nobody wanted what he was selling. Sam Walton did not read losing his store as proof that he was not capable of building one. They each made the same decision at the moment of maximum failure. And that decision is what this video is going to show you how to make. Walt Disney was fired from the Kansas City Star newspaper by an editor who told him directly that he lacked imagination and had no good ideas. He was not a young man being gently redirected towards something more suitable. He was being told, by someone in a position of authority whose job it was to recognize talent, that the specific thing he believed he had, creative vision, was the precise thing he did not possess. Most people do not recover from that kind of verdict cleanly. It gets inside them. It becomes the voice they hear when they sit down to try again. But Walt Disney went back to Kansas City and founded Laugh-O-Gram Studios, an animation company that produced short animated fairy tales. The studio attracted enough attention to secure a contract, and for a brief period it looked like the verdict from the Kansas City Star had been wrong. Then Laugh-O-Gram went bankrupt in 1923. The contract fell apart, the money ran out, and Walt Disney found himself in Kansas City with a failed studio, a fired staff, and $40 in his pocket. He moved to Hollywood. Not after a period of recovery, not after taking time to regroup and reassess, but almost immediately, with $40 and the same conviction that had driven him into the newspaper office and then into the animation studio, carrying it forward into a city that had no particular reason to treat him any differently than Kansas City had. He founded the Disney Brothers Cartoon Studio with his brother Roy and began producing a series called the Alice Comedies. The road was not smooth. Financial pressures, disputes with distributors, and the constant uncertainty of building something in an industry that was still figuring out what it was. But Walt Disney kept making one consistent decision through all of it. He never let a failure become a conclusion. Every time something collapsed, he treated it as a question. What does this tell me about what needs to change, rather than as an answer about what he was capable of? That single interpretive habit, applied consistently across decades of genuine failure, is what eventually produced Disneyland, Walt Disney World, and one of the most recognized entertainment companies in the history of American business. If you have ever faced a failure so complete that the people around you quietly stopped expecting you to get back up, Walt Disney's story is proof that the verdict was never theirs to give. The Kansas City Star editor was wrong. The bankruptcy was not the end. Every person who suggested that Walt Disney's ambitions were financially unreasonable was looking at real evidence and drawing a completely understandable conclusion, and they were all wrong. Because they were reading the failure as a conclusion, and Walt Disney was reading it as a question. Walt Disney is not the only man in this story who heard no so many times it should have become his permanent address. In the early 1980s, a man named Howard Schultz walked into his 217th rejection and did something almost nobody in his position would have done. In 1983, Howard Schultz traveled to Milan, Italy, on a buying trip for a Seattle coffee company called Starbucks. At the time, a small retailer selling whole bean coffee and equipment, not beverages. What he experienced in the Italian espresso bars stopped him completely. The culture of the espresso bar, the sense of community, the ritual of the coffee, the way these places functioned as a third space between home and work where people gathered and lingered, was something he had never seen replicated in America. He came back to Seattle convinced that this was the idea that could change the way America related to coffee. His employers at Starbucks were not interested. So Howard Schultz left, and in 1986 founded his own coffee bar company called Il Giornale, with the intention of proving the concept before eventually acquiring the Starbucks name and brand in 1987. But between the idea and the funding stood something that would have stopped almost anyone else: 217 investors who said no. 217. That is not a rough approximation or a rounded figure. Howard Schultz documented it specifically in his own memoir, Pour Your Heart Into It, published in 1997. 217 separate conversations in which he presented his vision, made his case, and was told that it would not work, that Americans would not pay premium prices for coffee, that the market was not there, that the idea was not sound. 217 times. And what Howard Schultz did with each of those rejections is the detail that most people skip over when they tell his story. He kept count, not as a record of failure, not as a measure of how far he still had to go, but as evidence of proximity, because he understood something about rejection that most people never figure out. The 218th conversation was exactly as likely to be the yes as the first one had been. Stopping at 216 meant that the 217th no became the permanent answer. The only way to prevent that was to keep going until the number changed. And eventually, the number changed. Think about that in the context of your own life. How many times have you stopped before the number changed? How many conversations, how many applications, how many attempts did you walk away from? One or two short of the yes that was sitting on the other side of the next door. Howard Schultz's story does not suggest that rejection is comfortable or that it gets easier with repetition. What it suggests is that rejection is not a pattern. It is a number. And numbers are not permanent. They change when you keep going long enough to change them. Howard Schultz kept going through 217 of them. The company he eventually built, Starbucks, grew into a global brand with tens of thousands of locations in over 80 countries. Every single one of those locations exists because he did not stop at 216. And then there is Sam Walton, a man who did not just face rejection, but lost everything he had already successfully built, at an age when most men would have accepted it as the final answer the world had been trying to give them all along. In 1945, Sam Walton used a loan of $20,000 from his father-in-law and his own savings of $5,000 to purchase a Ben Franklin variety store franchise in Newport, Arkansas. He was 27 years old. He had no retail experience, and Newport was a small town that offered very limited room for the kind of ambition Sam Walton was already beginning to develop. But he worked that store with an intensity that nobody around him had seen in a retail operation that size, studying his competitors, experimenting with pricing, visiting other stores to learn what was working elsewhere, and building a customer base through sheer attentiveness to what people in his community actually wanted. Within a few years, his Newport store was the most profitable Ben Franklin franchise in a 6-state region. He had taken something ordinary and made it extraordinary through nothing more than careful observation and relentless willingness to try things differently. And then, in 1950, his landlord refused to renew his lease. The landlord's name was P.K. Holmes. He had watched Sam Walton build that store into something genuinely valuable, and he wanted it for his own son. The lease contained no renewal clause, an oversight Sam Walton later acknowledged in his autobiography, Made in America, was his own mistake for not having secured one. Holmes exercised his legal right not to renew, and Sam Walton was forced to sell the store's inventory and fixtures and walk away from everything he had spent 5 years building. He was 44 years old, the same age when most men are calculating what they have accumulated, not starting over from nothing. He moved his family to Bentonville, Arkansas, a town so small it barely registered on most maps, and leased a new space on the town square. He opened a store called Walton's Five and Dime in 1950 and started again. Not with bitterness. Not with the urgency of a man trying to prove something to P.K. Holmes or to anyone else who had witnessed what had just been taken from him, but with the quiet, settled determination of a man who had already learned the most important thing, that what he had built once, he could build again, and build better, because the one thing P.K. Holmes could not take from him was the knowledge of exactly how he had done it. That knowledge, the specific understanding of how to read a customer, how to price a product, how to build loyalty in a community that had other options, became the foundation of everything that followed. The Bentonville store succeeded. More stores followed. In 1962, Sam Walton opened the first Walmart in Rogers, Arkansas. By the time of his death in 1992, Walmart was the largest retail company in the United States. The man whose landlord had taken his most successful store at 44 years old had built the biggest retail operation in the history of American commerce, because he understood that what had been taken was the building, not the builder. Walt Disney, Howard Schultz, Sam Walton. 3 different men, 3 different industries, 3 completely different eras of American history. And the same decision running through all of them at the moment, when everything said stop. Walt Disney, Howard Schultz, and Sam Walton faced the same failures that stopped other men. They faced the same rejections, the same collapses, the same moments when the evidence was clear and the rational conclusion was to accept what the results were saying and stop. The men who almost built empires faced those same moments and stopped. The difference was not talent. It was not timing. It was not a lucky break that arrived at the right moment and changed everything. It was one decision, made at the moment of maximum difficulty, that the men who almost made it never made. And that decision is available to every single person watching this right now. The first application is this: reframe every failure as information, not verdict. Walt Disney did not read the Laugh-O-Gram Bankruptcy as proof that he could not build something. He read it as data about what needed to change. The firing from the Kansas City Star was not a verdict on his imagination. It was information about the wrong environment for it. The next time you face a failure, a lost client, a rejected proposal, a collapsed plan, do not ask yourself what it means about your limitations. Ask yourself what specific thing it is telling you about what needs to change. Write it down. One concrete lesson from the failure. Not one reason the failure proves you should stop. Walt Disney did this instinctively across decades of genuine collapse. It is a learnable habit, not a personality trait. The second application is this: keep your count. Howard Schultz knew he had been rejected 217 times before he received his first yes. The act of counting that number changes the psychology of rejection in a specific and powerful way. It shifts the internal narrative from "I keep failing" to "I am getting closer." When you track the number of rejections you have accumulated, each new rejection becomes evidence of proximity rather than evidence of impossibility. Start counting your rejections the way Howard Schultz counted his. Not as a record of failure, but as a measure of how close you are getting. Because the number eventually changes. It always changes for the people who do not stop before it does. The third application is this: separate what was taken from what you know. Sam Walton lost his Newport store. PK Homes took the building, the inventory, the location, the customer base that Sam Walton had spent 5 years building. What he could not take was the knowledge of how Sam Walton had built it, the understanding of pricing, of customer behavior, of what made a retail operation in a small American town genuinely thrive. Identify right now the one thing that no circumstance, no person, and no failure can ever remove from you. The skill you have developed. The understanding you have earned. The hard-won knowledge that exists only because you went through what you went through. That is the only foundation that never collapses. Everything built on it can be rebuilt. The men who almost built empires stopped one decision before the men who did. And that decision was never about talent, never about timing, and never about luck. It was always about what they chose to do with the moment when everything said stop. Walt Disney walked out of the Laugh-O-Gram bankruptcy in Kansas City in 1923 with $40 in his pocket and a fired staff behind him. The editor who had told him he lacked imagination was still at the Kansas City Star. The investors who had not believed in the studio were still in their offices. The verdict that the evidence supported at that moment, that this was a man who had tried, failed, and should now accept what the results were telling him, was completely reasonable. And it was completely wrong. The man who left Kansas City with $40 went on to build Disneyland, Walt Disney World, and one of the most recognized and enduring entertainment companies in the history of the world. The bankruptcy was not the end of his story. It was the last thing that had to happen before the real story could begin. So here is the question I want to leave you with today, and I want you to answer it honestly in the comments below. At what point in your own life have you come closest to stopping? The moment when the evidence was the clearest, when the people around you had the most reasonable case for why it was not going to work. And what was it that made you keep going anyway? Tell me in the comments. Because the answer to that question might be the most important thing you know about yourself. If this video gave you something real today, a lesson, a perspective, a reason to look differently at the moment you are in right now, subscribe to the Silent Fortunes. Because every single week, we come back here and uncover another story the world forgot to tell.